Hi everybody, and welcome to the next instalment of our DPE Decentralising Political Economies Roaming Symposium. And today we're going to look at hacking strategies for rethinking how we might intersect educational institutions with real social change. My name's John Byrne, and along with Poppy Bowers and Alessandra Saviotti, who we're pleased to have with us today, I'm developing the Decentralising Political Economies platform along with the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester, UK, the Association of RTU Teal. And one of the things that we're trying to do with that platform is to help to think of toolkits which we might all begin to be able to use and share as a means to instigate micro ground up real forms of change. One of the key principles of our thinking that we're beginning to set out and to try and test and deploy with the DPE project is that we can't simply step outside of the conditions that we're in. The conditions that we live under, neoliberalism, if you want to call it that, is asymmetric. So we can't simply adopt some kind of idea that provides us with an alterity that we can have a privileged view of. However, at the same time as this, we've also become very interested in the fact that trying to change institutions and trying to change the way we work requires different and new forms of collaboration. So one of the other principles that we want to examine is how we can begin to meaningfully reach out to non-Western and non-global North forms of thinking, not simply as a means of swish reappropriation, but of being able to think of how we can reinvent ourselves and act and do otherwise, not simply to just try to imagine ourselves symbolically so. So we've got a couple of really interesting contributors today, all of whom have these concerns at the core of their practice, and all of whom are trying to make forms of changes happen in the real world, so to speak. So I'm really looking forward to a discussion that helps us to ground some of those ideas and to help us to produce new ways of thinking and new forms of thought, which we can, as part of the project, distill and then take the next steps with DPE. And we hope to kind of come up with some kind of manifesto for the next stage of our change early in 2022. So without any further ado, what I'd like to do is ask our contributors today just to say a quick hello and to give us a quick introduction. They've all recorded brilliant videos of their key and core ideas, which if you've had a chance to look at before this conversation, great. If not, you can still look at later. But if we just get a little bit of a footing, a little bit of an idea of who everybody is, then I'm sure we can begin a really fruitful conversation. So first of all, I'm going to ask Sarah Lovell, if you'd kindly introduce yourself.
Thanks, John. So my name is Sarah Lovell, and I am the lead policy officer for culture across the Liverpool City region at the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority. Very long title there. So my role essentially is to kind of work with and coordinate with the other 6 local authorities that make up the Liverpool City region, which is Halton, Sefton, St Helens, Knowsley, Liverpool and Wirral, and to work very closely, obviously, also with the sector. So I work with the cultural and creative sector. My policy area is captured in a combined authority portfolio, which includes visitor economy and tourism. And then I work closely with the growth platform, where the head of visitor economy and tourism is based. And also the sort of digital and creative industries is also based in the growth platform, which is part of the Liverpool Enterprise Partnership. So there's quite a lot of working across different organisations to sort of coordinate activity to implement strategy, to develop projects and to develop ways of working. And then I work very closely with the Liverpool Film Office on coordinating and supporting work to grow and sustain the film industry here, which is really quite big. And also with the music industry, we have a Liverpool City Region Music Board, and I work very closely with the head of UNESCO City of Music, because we do still have that UNESCO status. Might have lost the other one, but we've still got the UNESCO City of Music status. So we're going to see how we can develop on that. That's just a little bit of what we do.
Thank you, Sarah. That's really interesting. I'm really happy you agreed to come along to this, because I think one of the things that'd be good to do is to have these real conversations in which we see how people from various different spheres of engagement are trying to kind of implement sustainable change. And I think that would be really good for us to be able to think alongside you with this. And in the light of that, in terms of helping us to think through our relationships to forms of hacking and circulation, Kuba Szreder, could I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, so my name is Kuba Szreder, and I'm based in Warsaw. Currently, I work at the Academy of Fine Arts in teaching art theory at the theoretical department here. Also teaching quite a lot of stuff related to art utile. Very often referred to your practice as well, to discuss art beyond art or various forms of post-artistic practices. What you see in the background is a flag of the post-artistic bloc at the anti-fascist march in 2019, an image that is used as a cover, as one of the images on the cover of the book that I'm going to publish currently with the Whitworth Manual series. The book is called The ABC of the Projectariat, Living and Working in Precarious Art World. And in fact, like if you saw my videos, then I tried to discuss a bit what would it entail to hack the circulation. But I'll not talk about it now in this short introduction, then we can talk maybe a bit about it later on. And here I am also actually more, I think, not only as a art lecturer, but in fact as a person who was or who used to be and still is involved in many different art utile, post-artistic practices related initiatives. So for example, I work with the Office for Post-Artistic Services, the aim of which is to support various social movements with artistic competences. When I saw Manolo's and Annie's presentation today, I also thought about Warsaw University of Warsaw, a nomadic school that we used to run, like with a bunch of radical art workers in Warsaw throughout 2010s, from 2009 to more or less 2018. And then we also discussed a lot things related to labor conditions in the field of art, but also how it relates more generally to the neoliberal conditions of our lives as they are run now. And like considering the current climate in Poland, the discussions about the Fourth World War definitely ring the bell. So maybe that's it. And then and also like maybe just another thing, like that we also with Whitworth and with DPE, we work together with Katrin Baum as Center for Plausible Economy. So this is very important to mention, that we share this general idea that we need to reform or like realign the institutions with which we are currently affiliated, such as Whitworth museums or like different bottom-up initiatives, so that they can serve a larger social purpose. So thank you for having me here.
No, absolutely delighted to have you here, and also to pass on now to Alessandra Saviotti, who is in the unusual position insofar as this symposium is concerned of actually being a key contributor today. Alessandra usually has the job of introducing everything, and it has to be said does a much better job than I do. Alessandra, could you introduce yourself?
Thank you, John. I'm Alessandra Saviotti. I'm Italian, but I'm connecting from Amsterdam, where I live. And I work as a curator, educator, and I'm currently a PhD candidate at the Liverpool John Moores University, at the School of Art and Design, and I'm carrying on my project in the frame of in the context of the City Lab. I'm also, I feel, it's funny because I feel I have been working with the majority of the people that are currently on this call. So it's quite interesting to see how, let's say, my research or research-led approach has brought me really in many different places and in collaborating in many different with many different people and also assuming different roles. So for example, now I'm part of the panel, but I'm also one of the co-organizers of DPE, and I'm mostly taking care of the toolkit section. So that's why in my presentation, I try to highlight a little bit how I understand hacking, but also how hacking for me within the art context function really pretty much as a sort of infiltration tactic, let's say, because I presented two different projects. One is, let's say, a research that took the form of an art project, whether I'm not an artist, and the other one, it's actually a project which takes the form of a syllabus. So more, let's say, in the context of education. And I think it's quite interesting that I have the possibility to discuss with you and to talk about this project in the context of hacking strategies, because I think it resonates a lot with also what, of course, Manolo and Annie were talking about in their presentation, but of course what also Kuba mentioned, which is the idea that how hacking strategies or hackers in general, or like the extended idea of hackers are part of the system. So I pretty much see myself as part of a system that I'm trying to change little by little, but from within. So that's something that is quite relevant for me, for my practice. And I think, of course, it's pretty much, it can also be, like read, or like another of my main references is about the undercommons and how to create this sort of change from within with a very, let's say, strong approach. And I like to use the context of the art, which is, of course, the context that I know better, as a sort of excuse or alibi to do so. So that's why I always try to, like assume different roles, rethink my position, not to just confuse everybody, but perhaps also a little bit. So in order to, like activate this little change within the context where I work with. I just, like put forward already a lot, but just to say that I'm also a regular guest lecturer at the Artes University in the Netherlands, the University of the Arts, which is in Arnhem, and I'm co-teaching together with Gemma Medina, that she's also here. And I'm part of the association, the Arte Util, and yeah, I think I'll hand it here. So perhaps other things are also coming during the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks for that. That's a really good introduction, and also kind of a supportive framing of what we can begin to look at today. Before I kind of open it into the first questions and discussions, last but not least, can I also ask, we're really happy to have Manolo, Callahan and Annie Paradise along as well at a ridiculously early hour in the morning, joining us from the Bay Area in San Francisco. Yeah, could you give us a kind of contextualizing introduction of yourself as well?
Yeah, well, it's good to see old friends and meet new people here. And we're excited to be here, of course, and thanks to everybody who made this possible. Sorry, yeah, it's early. I guess what in my case, well, I'm currently Ronin. I'm a mercenary traveling from academic fiefdom to fiefdom here across the Bay, and I can't seem to get a 10-year gig for lots of reasons, lost some. And that really that begins, and this, I guess, part to contextualize where I'm coming from and where Ani and I work we've been doing lately is I started out as a strategic Chicano in the sense that I'm ethnic Mexican, but of course I embraced Chicanismo in a militant way and we wanted to take over the academy. And all that seemed to do is produce a brown managerial class. And once we realized that, we recognized that I think we also perfected the bar seminar as an insurgent learning and convivial research space and started to think about that. Of course, that coincided with our walking with the Zapatistas. And it's in that moment we started Universidad de la Tierra Califas, but also we started the Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy, so that the Universidad de la Tierra Califas wouldn't be contaminated by money. And much of like the privatization and extractivism and individuation that Kuba talked about, but also to try to think about how we're rooting in a kind of really rigorous way locally, slowing down capitalist time and building relationships. And initially that was through the bar seminar, and we were, had dreams of reclaiming the local pub that capitalism has destroyed, but thought Universidad de la Tierra could be that vehicle. And so we've been playing and inventing and basically joking around in some ways, but in very serious ways as well, with different kinds of autonomous learning spaces. And really thinking about it as a social infrastructure of community, to rebuild that social infrastructure of community that we've lost. So yeah, we've been thinking about different kinds of pedagogies in that process that are not mediated by the academy, but take seriously the academy. I mean, we agree that we can't ignore these institutions because, as I said, I'm Ronin. I'm adjunct at like 3 different campuses right now. But the question for us has been how to appropriate funds and resources and build community and build relationships.
Annie.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, evening. Manolo, it's 8 a.m., but you just made me want to retire to a pub and start have a pint with everybody here. I would first just echo to some of the pre-conversation, I guess, around just one, how grateful we are to be invited and to connect with Alessandra and John and Poppy, and how much this connection has been a space for us to learn what other groups are doing. And the entire DPE Symposium strategy is we've been talking just about how brilliant it is in its refusal of the event of us just coming together, but instead the architecture that's created to put us all into dialogue before we arrive here. And as Manolo said, we're always borrowing and appropriating. And I think the number of tools that we're already able to kind of appropriate from all of the struggles and thinking that you all are doing just opens up a lot for us and makes us also recognize that, there's more of us than sometimes we think, and that, we have comrades in many places. So that's always good too. Sometimes we tend to lean towards more of a, excuse me, a anarchist, autonomist kind of position. And sometimes that can be a lonely place. And so often not, but sometimes. And so to know that we have comrades far and wide is we're very appreciative of the invite. And to think with everybody, and even the videos of folks who aren't here have, it's just been this wide texture of engaging so many vibrant things and seeing everybody's work. Like Manolo, we were in CCRA, we're a trans-territorial research collective. Actually, Alessandra gave a wonderful introduction to who we were recently, I think we're going to use that, a nomadic, but I don't remember we have to write it down, but a nomadic, we'll have to go back to it, but we like to also just mark that we're trans-territorial. Some of our members are some of our collective is in the Yucatan in Mexico. A lot of our work has been really around an urban zapatismo, as Manolo named. How are we learning from indigenous autonomy, from the Zapatistas to the Indigenous National Congress and other groups? Our work locally is a lot around struggles against militarization, police violence, counterinsurgency, linking counterinsurgencies in Mexico with counterinsurgencies here to try to understand more fully what we're up against and how we're fighting against counterinsurgency collectively. We also, I think, recently have been picking up a notion around monstrous complicity. So we're always also managing a kind of social movement here that is very much mediated by the nonprofit and by a lot of the things, Kuba, I think that you speak about as well in the talk that we saw, that is constantly reproducing a spectacle of individualization, social capital that gets consolidated into particular actors. And so I think locally we're always trying to navigate that terrain. And so it's within that context. We've worked in prisons for many, many years here in the women's prisons. We'll talk more about it in our talk. I guess the one thing I would add to, then we can, when we get started, we can say more about it. I think that one of the things that's coming out in so many of the talks that we saw here, and that there's so many moments that resonate with our work and help us think our work more clearly. But certainly this idea around, invention and inventing things. And as Manolo was talking about, we stake out these projects in many ways and then see what they can become. So we have the Center for Appropriated Technologies that has no building. It's a way of naming what we borrow from all of you and struggles on the ground. We've recently started 2 spaces, the Counterinsurgency Lab, which we can speak more about, and that's a cluster of many groups and comrades. We've also started a space called, we call it Methodologies Against Forgetting and Oblivion, which we see as a critical kind of fortress in responding to and reclaiming our conviviality against the Fourth World War. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about and we're excited to jump in. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. To get the ball rolling, so to speak, another one of my many football metaphors, what I'd like to do really is to start from an assumption that we kind of, we share some points of view, but I'd like to link what we're going to say today to some of the ideas that have been coming through DPE and certainly through this symposium. One of the things that is cropping up a lot really, and perhaps quite obviously, is how we began to rethink culture under the conditions of pandemic. We probably all agree that during the lockdowns that we're still semi-subject to, there was a lot of points at which the current systems as we understand them to be began to show some of the contradictions in terms of racial oppression or in terms of their inability to cope. As a result of that, there were a lot of initiatives that were brilliant, lots of local community initiatives to try and compensate for helping each other, feeding each other, doing things together, etc. And that really began to illuminate the possibility that we really could think and work together otherwise, that there are possibilities to reimagine communities and to reimagine through culture. What's interesting to me at the moment, and I'd like your help with this, is quite similar to the economic crash of 2007, 2008. The immediate response seems to be from governments across the world to kind of snap back to grid, to almost pretend none of that ever happened. So what I want to kind of ask you guys is what do you think we can do or need to do in order to maintain that momentum for trying to develop real forms of community in real and live projects that we might have to hand and that are ready to hand, and that can, and to use one of Alessandra's phrases, and how can we do that? By using art as an alibi. Due to the fact that we're kind of working quite a lot together on trying to get some projects off the ground in the real world, can I pass that over to you first, Sarah, which is a semi-rotten thing to do, but
oh, thanks, John. No, it's fine. I think it's really interesting listening to all of you guys, because I find myself in a political organisation. You know, the combined authority is a metromayoral combined authority that works across with political leaders within the other 6 local authorities. And my background is in theatre, participatory theatre, community theatre, theatre with young people. So I have worked in lots of very grassroots projects and initiatives that often have kind of worked against the status quo. So it's an interesting perspective to then come in. And so I see my role very much as an advocate for the sector. I am very grassroots driven, but I also have to balance off and challenge the, I think, some of the expectations of political leaders and how culture is used as a driver for visitor economy, which is particularly synonymous with the Liverpool city centre post, well, leading up to and post the capital of culture, which did transform the city's fortunes, and it took a longer time, but the perceptions of the city that had been in decline and was I mean, referred to in Thatcher's famous speech of managing decline, the city, because they didn't want to put any money in it. And so I think, you know, what's an interesting kind of sometimes dilemma in this is how to stay true to your own values and practice and the knowledge that you have of the sector and what the needs are. And I think particularly the pandemic exposed that. We've always recognized the fragility and the vulnerability of the sector, because it's been very reliant on freelance economy. And, you know, a lot of people come into the sector because they're driven by their passions, they're driven by socially engaged motivations. And but where you are working alongside kind of institutions who, because of their business models, you know, were suddenly impacted in a way that maybe they hadn't experienced previously. The layers that support that are the freelance sector, and you know, if we look in theatre, for example, 80% of the ecosystem of theatre is freelance. So whilst the government was stepping in to prop up the organisations that couldn't be seen to fail, which, you know, understandably is important, there wasn't the same recognition for the freelance sector, and there wasn't the same understanding of what people need in order to be able to support that ecosystem. And yet the dichotomy being, at the same time, the sort of flexibility and the responsiveness that freelancers and small arts organisations or collectives were able to do in order to respond to the pandemic, in terms of setting up opportunities for communities to come together, whether that be through sharing food, whether it be through digital exclusion, whether it be through communication, whether it be through activities, whether it be through initiatives to support individual artists to create things that would enable a community opportunity to bring people together because people were so isolated. So that was very challenging in terms of, trying to steer the focus in that direction and say, you've got to do that. And then the response being, it's quite a lumpy sector. It's a lumpy sector. It's complicated. It's not an easy fix. And you go, yeah, I know it's not an easy fix, but this is what we have to do. So I think in terms of that, then at the time, seeing some of the incredible opportunities that came out of that, seeing some of the amazing innovative ways that people repivoted their practice, their business models, their ways of working, their ways of engaging, and being able to support it at quite a local level. I'll give you one example. We recognise, particularly in the music industry, which is on the one extreme, a massive global, infrastructure, and at the other end, you have people that just want to play and just want to make a living and just create, and everything in between. And I think a lot of the government support that was put in place just didn't address those people. So there were lots of people we could see were falling through the cracks because they didn't fit into any of the categories. They didn't fit into the tax, reference points that were at the back of some of those support mechanisms. So we repurposed some money that we were developing for a music industry support structure to help to build that system, to give small grants. And we had to argue the case about, well, even a small amount of money can actually make a huge difference because you're working on such different reference points of economies of scale. So to have those internal conversations with the director of investment and say, no, we really do we can make a difference on this. And that was really interesting to see. And what was fascinating was that although it was kind of set up as a bit of a hardship fund, it was the capacity within those individuals to actually take that money and do something more creative with it. And one example was a company that sort of looked at digital and online ways of communicating what they did, and they were able to actually generate an income from that far exceeded even some of what they did normally. And I think that was a really interesting example of that sort of ways in which how we place value on the creativity of what people do and what they can generate and what they can give back. And for me, I think what we've been poor at recognizing for a long time is the social value impact. Everything is measured through GVA, everything's measured through financial kind of means. But actually the social value of how we recognize the importance of creativity as a social glue for our communities, as fulfilling a need within people to stimulate creative ways of working, to address social issues, to redress some of those imbalances. And I think the pandemic did expose a lot of that in a way that I remember at the time thinking almost like, this is almost like ground zero. We could rebuild our whole system. And like you say, John, it does feel at times that there's a slipping back to business as usual. And yet within the cultural sector, there's very much a rejection of that. But there is that very strong challenge. So some of what we're trying to do is on the back of an initiative that we have called the Borough of Culture, which we give a small amount of seed funding to do to local authorities to stimulate creativity, talent development, skills, new ways of working in their boroughs, to develop provision for people in their localities, there's a project that's been set up in Holton, which is the current borough of Culture, called Culture HQ. So it's repurposing an old shop unit, retail unit in Runcorn Shopping City. And through the genesis of creating a space, which is not just a space for exhibiting work by local artists or running workshops, but it also became a hub. It's become a hub, and it's become a catalyst for people to discover each other. So again, often what happens, as we all know, is that people get very siloed, they get very isolated. Now, COVID did that to everybody, but within the cultural and creative communities, people are often siloed or isolated, or and I think what they found within just running the project was that there was this opportunity for people to literally come out and say, I'm here and I would love to get involved with more artists and start the conversation or start to work together. So it's helped to kind of catalyze that, but also one of the things that John and I have been talking about with the City Lab is to create some opportunities for new pieces of work to happen, to look at taking a hacking approach, ways of engaging the community, because you can, within that space, you've got a shop, literally a shop window, which is, I suppose, for a lot of people, art and culture can sometimes feel very removed, or it's kind of guarded in institutions, and there are thresholds that you have to navigate. And the wonderful thing about a shopping centre is that people just discover, and often, or in the street, they can just stumble across something and engage with it in a way that doesn't have those kind of permissions or rules or perceptions around it. So one of the things that we're looking at is how we can stimulate some ways of working with some of those found artists who were unknown to the cultural leads, and even some of the other artists in the borough, and find ways of engaging with different groups who maybe don't normally engage, and staff from the City Lab and LJMU to come up with things that are relevant and resonate with those particular individuals and communities and issues that they want to explore, so that the work is more grounded and it is owned by the individuals themselves, and it is a process of discovery and co-creation, as opposed to the other way. But you guys know all of this. This is what you do all the time. It's just, for me, it's an interesting opportunity to work some of this into what can be sometimes quite a complicated, let's put it like that, environment with a whole other range of expectations.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I think that's really kind of mapped out a really interesting and real world territory, and as a footnote to that, I'm very, very grateful for you agreeing to work with us via the City Lab to actually allow us at LJMU to actually begin to hack ourselves in a way that we can try to help and forge new ways of thinking within a community like Halton. I also really like that idea of art just not simply being removed but being guarded within institutions, and that's something kind of we want to dissolve. But in that light of wanting to kind of maintain and grow some of the advantages that we saw exposed in terms of rethinking community and rethinking of how we might live our lives otherwise, that began to become much more explicit during pandemic, and what we might need to do now in order to continue that impetus. Can I pass the virtual mic to Cuba?
Okay. Yeah, thanks. I just wonder maybe I'll start with an anecdote. Just very recently, I was at the music festival in Krakow, and then one Italian journalist made an interview with me about the ABC of Projectariat, because that was the first kind of like premiere. And then we had a chat about situation in Italy and how politicized people became, especially in the cultural industries and arts and creative industries due to pandemic. Because lots of them realized how fragile their precious trajectories and careers are. So like people do think about themselves, tend to think about themselves in the arts as kind of like privileged or middle class. Some of them are, but in fact, lots of them are just a couple of, you know, like months of bad luck from a serious slippage, and like in a sense of like losing a house, or like, you know, like very, very serious troubles because, you know, like one contract falls through, another project does not appear. If you are seriously ill, then you are really in deep troubles. If you are basically not young and healthy, you are very soon out of the game. This is like, you know, this is, or if you have dependents, it might be the kids or elderly parents, you know, if you cannot travel so much, and so on and so forth. And taking a look at the responses to the pandemic, of course, we need to think that we are talking about a very privileged societies. Like some of them are more privileged, some others a bit less, you know, but if there was any kind of like a response run by the state, possibly it means that there is some level of state power to be mastered in this kind of conditions. So these are typically countries of the global north that are able to do just that. But clearly, you know, artists run the best in the places in which other people run the best as well. I mean, so that the state took some sort of responsibility for providing furlough money, or like provided some sort of like subsidies for people who are out of work. Typically for artists, the problem was that they are freelancers, so neither they are having companies nor they are employed. But then, you know, there are like so many people like that. Like recently with Manolo, we were in Madrid, and then where there was discussion about art for universal basic income. And a lot of people were talking about it in the context of pandemic. There was a beautiful theater piece enacted there based on real people's kind of interviews with people who had to go through the pandemic, like most of us had. And of course, like, you know, this problem with 0 hours contracts, with temporary jobs, with lack of stable employment, with lack of employers protection. It is a perennial or endemic issue in the labor markets that are defined, or like that are somehow ravaged by neoliberalism, as you John said. So then, you know, like maybe just to take this, take this point a bit further, I would say that artists are not particularly exceptional. They share a lot of problems with other people who are just as precarious as they are, and the sooner they get to understand it, the better it will be for them and others, I guess. And then exceptionalism does not really work as a policy, not any longer. You know, people, for example, in Poland, they were furious, like regular kind of citizens. Of course, we are like having this, like, you need to add to that, like this heated cultural wars. I'm sure that, like, you know, our comrades from States, but also from UK, from other places, also are very well acquainted with this situation in which artists or other intellectuals are presented as egg-headed parasites who just, you know, try to feed on this healthy social body or whatever, you know, like this kind of vocabularies are around. You know, why my taxes are spent on this bunch of lazy this or that, right? So then like, you know, exceptionalism doesn't really work. People then are, you know, like they ask, I think pretty sensibly, why them and not us, you know. So if you have this kind of very split and divided social sphere in which one social group competes with other social groups, then you end up in this kind of divide and conquer sort of policies in which, you know, you can pitch one group against the other. whilst in fact the policies that really work are the ones that address underlying problems of precarious conditions, like for example availability of housing or social welfare for everyone. Like in UK you have NHS. In Poland you need to be employed in order to access health systems. So then of course, you know, then it creates a lot of troubles, particularly for people who are on freelance, but also for all the people who are employed either illegally or like migrants as well, of course, you know, like all the people who are do not have like a regular status as proper employers. So I would suggest, like, once again, that, you know, that we need to think about the situation in a wider context of precarity and very unjust, very often unjust labor markets.
Thanks for that, Cuba. It was as always a brilliant and insightful interjection there. And I think one of the things for me that you've raised really clearly there is what was once separated by people working as artists who might have seen themselves as being somehow exceptional, was how that precarity is actually shared by many, many people and is not very far away from an edge beyond which, if you fall off it, you'll just be in the same place as everybody else, really. And also, I think one of the territories that we're kind of working within in order to try and help to reinvent our notions of community and connection through art and culture is a territory which, in a sense, has already been occupied and invaded by a neoliberalism that's already hacked and used art as an alibi to justify its notions of a very radical and alienated form of precarious labour, as if it was some form of artistic autonomy.
Maybe I'll just add to that, John. You know, like, sorry, I don't want to take too much space, but maybe one clarification that is very important, because we used such names as artists to cover a very, very diverse group.
Yeah.
So I guess, like, you know, we were all seeing like this. I mean, terrifying images in which you have like stock market growth in comparison with all, like, on the news, right? With like all these images of stock markets just skyrocketing, while we knew that lots of people just losing jobs and they just don't have money to eat and to buy food and so on, you know. And I think that, like, for some artists who are like you know, who like are very directly aligned with 1% and with art market and with high end of like blue chip art market, it was good days. I mean, they had nice houses somewhere outside, or nice studios somewhere outside the like, city centers. They could spend the pandemic, like, you know, relaxing and maybe doing yoga and selling the images online. Maybe it was a bit of a slump, you know, maybe there wasn't a party in Basel or somewhere there, but this was a like white man's problems, right? And then like, but then I think 99% of people in cultural industries really had tremendous problems. I mean, we all know the stories, right, of people just losing projects, just on freelance, didn't know what to do, how to pay rent, you know, how to, even if they had COVID, they were really in the deep troubles. So I would suggest that, you know, when we talk artists, you know, this is, it's not precise enough. Like, they're like really artists and they're artists, you know, they're like a lot of different people under this that we try to cover due to our traditions under the same name, whilst in fact there are like lots of different people.
Yeah, I think one of the, you know, with that, again, that's a brilliant contribution, and just before I kind of pass the conversation on, I'd just like to say I agree, and maybe one of the things that we need to do and to develop tools for is to rethink much more sufficient and sophisticated notions and discourses around what generalizations like artist and autonomy might be, because they're broad, overdetermined explanations are often used, as we're saying, as alibis by neoliberalism to get away with a whole lot of sins, and rethinking those more granular meanings and subjectivities is probably one of the most urgent things we need to do. And in and as an extension of that, really, I'm going to actually pass over now to Alessandra in terms of the work that Alessandra, you've done yourself, and especially the work you've done with HEMA as well, in terms of trying to work with the Association of Autonomy and all kinds of communities to try to develop toolkits for change. Because one of the things that, as you know, I've always been curious about is when you go to the Association of Autonomy website and look at the look at the archive. Many of my students, when they look at that, they see that as an online exhibition of great work that they would like to aspire to and be on as well, rather than seeing it as an open source toolkit for change. And a lot of complexities in that emerged in our last discussions as well, about ownership of artistic copyright and all kinds of things. But could you maybe help us with some of the insights that you've gained from working with developing toolkits over the last decade or so?
Yeah, it is actually quite a decade. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, where should I start from? So basically, the idea of the toolkit for me, it's of course really fascinating, because like thinking about what also Kuba just mentioned, or actually and you also, John, this idea of the fragmentation and of the sector, let's say, or atomization of artists as workers or not, because I think that perhaps I'll go back to that later, but with another anecdote. But the idea of the toolkit is quite interesting, because the archive that was created or put together by HEMA and myself helped us to understand a little bit what this idea of toolkit means. So at the beginning, we really didn't have an idea of how to use the archive beyond the exhibition space for what it was created, or beyond the fact that it was belonging to a certain kind of research, right? But of course, in using it, and not just us using it, but like some of you used it in a very different ways, we discovered that there was a real potentiality for this archive beyond the institutional framework, but even beyond the art context, basically. So I started thinking about the idea of also using the project or some of the case studies as a manual to do something else, or something that emerged also from the other panel was just this idea of creating the toolkit of toolkits, which, you know, like it might seem really crazy, but the idea is really to also a little bit going against the fact that the artwork is just one artwork. So the idea with the archive is actually to go beyond the idea of scarcity that exists pretty much in the art. So it's, you know, like it's unresolved. I don't have actually the answer to if it's good or if it is wrong. But after like the experience of really using the archive in many different contexts, I think what emerged, not just from my perspective, but also from other people engaging with that is a device that can create transnational solidarity. And this is something that is quite interesting, because it's like it comprehends now 300 case studies coming from very different places, and also intersecting or operating with different fields, not just the art, but like some of them are not even perceivable as art projects. So they really operate between the lines of what is art and what is not art. But the idea of having like a place where to go in order to find like some, you know, like refuge from what you have been trying to do in your community it's quite powerful, at least to see that your project or your case studies might be part of something bigger and something radical and something that it was not recognized until it was put together. So like the idea was really to create a sort of history of this kind of projects that could become a toolkit for change, I think. And the fact that we used the art as a way to frame this kind of projects, of course, is not my idea, because the archive has been there because was part of a vision of Tania Bruguera, who is the artist that, let's say, initiated this process of creating an history or an institutional history of this kind of practices, because they are not there because of the archive, of course. Like the archive was an excuse to give them visibility within a context that really didn't give the right attention to this kind of practices. I think it's quite powerful because it allows different ways of approaching this kind of practices within an institutional level, but they highlight that a change is possible, actually. So the idea of the toolkit, and I think like the fact that it was, you know, like facilitated by different institutions, not just the museum, that allowed, let's say, or like funded the first step of the project is quite important, because I was talking about transnational solidarity, but I think trans-institutional solidarity is also very important. And with the toolkit, we are actually learning by doing, literally. So we didn't have any idea of how to emancipate usership around the archive until we started actually using it ourselves. So beside being the researcher, so of like just gathering information and putting the archive together, but really try to, for example, activate a syllabus using the archive as a sort of repository for like where to take, let's say, the information or the readings, etc., etc. So we really, let's say, try to reverse the mechanism, really starting from a practice that became the toolkit itself. I mean, I'm really happy that I haven't lost interest in this process, because I have been working around that since very long time. But I think this is also something that I start to recognize as another kind of strategy. So the fact that like the time of the project is really long, and it's not that it's always easy, because, you know, like most of the time we have been working as volunteers around this project. But the fact that like time became the currency to sustain this project, I think I start recognizing it also through DPE, that is quite a powerful is a more powerful currency to use, like this idea of time commitment rather than you know, like money commitment. And then of course I'm talking like from a privileged position, because I'm a PhD student, I have my funding to do that. But I think like the flexibility of having the possibility to navigate this kind of institutional path differently, it's quite yeah, it's difficult, but it's possible, I would say. And I wanted to refer to what Kuba said about the interview with the Italian journalist, and this is something that it's part. I really feel close to what the journalist said. Because during the pandemic, actually, with another person that is here in the room, we were involved in, let's say, the first association that is gathering art workers in Italy, which is called Art Workers Italia. And I think this is quite special, because because of the fact that artists are not exceptional until they are, because they are not considered workers, they have been excluded from all the benefits or like the welfare measures that a state like Italy could put into place for workers and for vulnerable people. So it's definitely true that not art workers are the same, and most of them, not most of, I don't know most of them, but many of them are working like in a sort of privileged position. But I think the effect of the pandemic, that was of course terrible, it was also like some people understood that real solidarity was actually needed in order to escape, let's say, this kind of disaster that was happening. So I think that's what I wanted to say with respect to that, because also like the association helped us to organize otherwise and really for the very first time go beyond the idea of our single research and our single art project, because we really needed to come together and help each other in order, you know, like not to lose our house or healthcare, etc., etc., etc. So, and I think that is still a process that is going on. Of course, it's very new. The association is like 1 year old, 1 year and a month old, but like it shaked a little bit the art system in Italy, because we actually unionized. It's not a union, but you know, it's quite powerful to actually go public and say we have to work together with the institution, because otherwise we cannot survive. And then of course I believe this is also part of my research in try to hack and try to build network of solidarity and collaboration.
Thanks so much for that. That was another great kind of build upon that initial question of what we might need to do and think about in order to develop strategies for maintaining kind of forms of community that have been brought up by the conditions of pandemic and beyond. And you know, I'd like to kind of, I absolutely love that idea of the Archive of the Association of Arte Utile as a device for transnational solidarity. And I think you're right that trans-institutional solidarity is key there too. And what's at the core of that is actually that kind of phrase that you use, that change is possible. I think if change isn't possible, then we're lost. But in order to affect that change, and also I'm going to kind of like allow myself to openly say that I'd like to turn to Manolo and Annie now in a form of self-interested hacking, because we've been talking with Annie and Manolo for a while now as emerging comrades, and one of the things that I think Manolo especially has kind of talked about the cracks and fissures that the COVID pandemic has thrown up. But I'm also very interested in your work with your centre and your various mechanisms for assembly and co-learning and co-producing of how we might begin to help sustain these struggles, because they are struggles, by reaching out to non-Western and non-global North forms of thinking. You know, one of those that came up in the discussion that you posted before this was that the idea of the techio, for example, which was something that I thought, you know, we reach out to an indigenous term to describe a form of shared co-labor, which almost precedes the idea of a capitalist and quantitatively measured and financialized kind of labor. So yeah, if I could turn to you guys as well now to see what you think might be some of the most essential things that we need to do now in order to reinforce and to grow the possibility of community that started to emerge during pandemic.
Yeah, well, for us, I think we operate under, we take very seriously this idea that racial patriarchal capitalism doesn't work. It never succeeds. I think we all share that notion. It never fully succeeds in capture. So part of our task is to expose that very fact that our insurgency is very active and so on. So for us, of course, that begins with 1992, actually, in the LA rebellion, then quickly followed by 94, where neoliberalism wasn't working and the militarized policing and counterinsurgency was being refused. It was refused in LA with the subversion of the gang truces against the counterinsurgency in urban communities of color. And then with the Zapatistas, it made it very clear that neoliberalism doesn't work. And then, of course, yes, with 2001 and in 2008 and then the pandemic, this mixed bag of crisis and then repression, but also exposing how fragile we are as workers. So yeah, we start from that premise. And then, of course, for us in what was really critical in the Escuelita, so the Zapatistas have for us shared a critical tool, and that's the politics of encounters, the space of encounter as an autonomous space of learning to do what we've been calling convivial research and insurgent learning, which is basically what everybody's discussed here, this kind of thinking of new tools and being rooted in community and building new relationships and breaking down the time and disrupting capture and disrupting the capitalist relation. But part of the task is to actually recognize where the practices of autonomy are still very vibrant. And for us, that has not been exclusively in the global South, but very visibly in the global South. And so, for example, when we've been participating in the Zapatista Encuentros, both in Chiapas and abroad, since their beginning, since the Democratic National Convention. But it's in the Escuelita when they invite people to actually work alongside them in the campo, in the milpa. And for us, that was really a clear moment because it was clear that they were theorizing and saying in their way that we have to refuse labor or manage labor and reclaim work. And where that work is the convivial work that we do to reproduce our communities. I mean, we all work. We're also forced to labor. So, again, that opened up all kinds of discussions and reading and research for us. And of course, we were engaging various forms of Marxism and post-Marxism. And is it value? Is it labor? Is it commodity? Is it all these discussions that are important, of course, and we're privileged enough to be able to kind of sift through all of that. But for us, again, we're thinking in terms of conceptual tools in this case. Then, what's the toolkit that we need from whatever Marxist or anarchist or autonomous theorization that we need to move strategically, and how to link that with the convivial tool that we're actually also engaging on the ground, right? And to bring those into contact, to kind of bring those together. So that's partly what we've been, trying to think through with the autonomous learning space. And for just as an example, as Kuba said, we were all at the Zapatista Forum, and then Andy and Kuba were on as part of this performance art. Militant research is a really beautiful moment, and the understanding was, my understanding of it was that there had been all this, the surveys and research with people who were managing the pandemic and struggling, and then they produced these kinds of voices and subjects that were speaking and sharing then the experience, and then the people who were actually part of it were present, and then all of us that were convened in the space. and then the panel to help kind of bring out some of these issues and some of the tensions and some of the research and et cetera, which was really a beautiful combination. But I mentioned it because my understanding was that it was supposed to be outside, it was supposed to be executed, to, performed, so to speak, in quotes, outside the Sophia, outside the museum, in the community, in the plaza, where there's all this action and hustle and bustle. But it was forced back into the garden within the Sophia. So it was forced back into this kind of private, even though the space is very open and people can get it in and out of it and so on. But it was contained. It was, so it was brilliant, but contained. So it was a good metaphor for what we were, struggling with, because one of the reasons why we were so excited to be part of the Zapatista Forum was for us to be in a space to think together with others who've been, like everybody here on this call, who've been doing this for a very long time. And for us, the way we're trying to understand, like, again, the convivial tool that seems to be emerging out of the community as a way to reproduce the community and contest capital is this autonomous space of learning. So it seems to us that something that we all have in common is that we convene these spaces. And we were in Madrid. Madrid has a long history of the social center, as does Europe, of the social centers and various versions of the social center, but also kind of we also recognize it happening in a very immediate moment, and coming out of the militant moments of direct actions and these big mobilizations and even smaller direct actions and so on. So that's what we're trying to think through, and this is what we mean by convivial research. We believe, we have a faith that people, when they're self-organized, right, produce a tool. And our task as convivial researchers is to be able to kind of listen for that tool, to kind of recognize and engage that tool, and to learn from it and to see how it circulates. And then to see, of course, what it tells us about ourselves. Illich called that, in his version of that was counterfoil research, where, we have to identify the industrial tool and then critique that and, see how corrosive it is, but then to kind of fall back and take on the convivial tools and kind of reclaim those convivial tools. So for us, the convivial tools that, we kind of fall back on are Milpa, Asamblea, Tequio, Cargo, Fiesta. All of these are central to the regeneration of a village, right? That, of course, we don't have in the North anymore, with some small exceptions, in some parts of the country. So then the question is, can the global North learn from the global South? And, can it appropriate those tools in a serious but thoughtful and reflective and non-extractivist way? And without reproducing a colonial relationship in either representation or research or artistic exhibition or what have you. And if you asked us 20 years ago, we would have said absolutely. Now we're less we're losing our faith that the global North, in the sense that the global North is just so much tremendous arrogance in the global North that we haven't even begun to, because even when we're celebrating the South, we end up either commodifying it or colonizing it, or narrating it. And for us, that's really clear in a really local way, in the terms of, like Ani was mentioning about this kind of nonprofit industrial complex system of capture. We can't help but name this violence that capital produces as a problem. And then we name the criminalized subject of that violence as the problem. So we have 10,000 houseless people in Santa Clara County, right? Santa Clara County, San Jose is the second biggest city in California. California is the sixth biggest economy in the country, in the world. We have 10,000 houseless in Santa Clara. And we have a huge nonprofit industrial complex, as you all know, and it only sees the houseless as a problem. How do we solve this problem? Which, of course, capitalism can't, in its best version, cannot do, of course. So just to give you an example, One of the kind of key technologies that Universidad de la Tierra in Oaxaca started out sharing was the dry latrine. And the dry latrine is spreading throughout Latin America because, of course, the US and Europe and Canada are taking Mexico's water. So people can't shit and rely on water the way, the flush toilet, I could speak for an hour about this, takes a tremendous amount of water, a huge amount of water for the flush toilet. And of course, the West, the kind of global North, wants to invent a better flush toilet. And you see these assholes in their space rockets, none of their toilets work. They're pissing all over themselves. But the dry latrine, in a very basic, simple way, and this is a technology that is coming out of the global South. You separate urine from fecal matter, then you put lye on the fecal matter, it disposes quite quickly, and urine is pretty much harmless. And you don't need a lot of water to move that toxic cocktail. You separate them out, and it's absolutely waterless. And of course, everybody in this call knows the battle is going to be water. We're already in that battle. So for us, yeah, the pandemic here for us exposed a lot, of course, and we were also, many of our CCRA members are either unemployed or underemployed. And the pandemic hit Yucatan very hard, hit southern Mexico very hard. It hit the Bay Area as well. And of course, we were dealing with fires here for 2 years alongside. We had these astonishing moments where we were just in a red fog for days, so yeah, capitalism doesn't work. We know that. We know that everybody knows that the environment is in almost irreparable moment. Capital doesn't work and the state doesn't work. We know that everybody knows that. So for us, the question about a conviviality, as what Illich said, we need a Copernican revolution to kind of rethink our relation to commodity. And for us, part of that commodity is the very way we produce knowledge as cultural workers. Absolutely, to kind of detach ourselves from that. The result, of course, has been that we can't seem to appropriate even cleverly funds. So we're either, you can say about us that we're either deliberately honest and above capital and uncontaminated, or we're just foolish and we don't know what the fuck we're doing. Maybe or some combination of both. But yeah, so we're trying to think seriously, like, well, how would, for example, we take to Santa Clara County and say, hey man, the dry latrine solves the problem with everybody's anxiety about where houseless people are shitting because they have no place, no dwelling, they no shelter. And so that's what we're trying to figure out. What's the secret there? What's the mechanism? Because we've been in nonprofit meetings and say, well, we've got this thing called a dry latrine. And if we take the dry latrine, it will change how everybody thinks at City Hall. And it'll change how all the nonprofit thinks in downtown San Francisco in their nice little offices. But you get laughed at. That's why we're always at the bar drinking about how that meeting went. So.
Annie, would you like to come in on that?
I sure would. Thank you. As we're all talking today, I'm thinking that one of the kind of a very salient hacking strategy for us that we've taken very seriously as a point of inspiration is the Pablo de Soto's hacking situation room, and which was basically a kind of project that that analyzed forms of counterinsurgency in the context of an art project. And I think that we think about the pandemic, I think there's a lot that has been made possible in terms of imagining these like, for instance, the space that folks are referencing in Madrid. A lot has been made possible in terms of imagining spaces of encounter that can also be blended. So a combination of people coming together and also networked with larger outside institutions and groups. And one of the ways we've always imagined pulling together our own situation room here as the counterinsurgency lab has been to have a number of projects and a number of technologies intersecting in one space to create a collective map on how we're experiencing counterinsurgency, what we understand about the operations, the strategies, the forms of policing, and to kind of also bring together the many areas of resistance against those strategies. So where the situation room originally was more of a war room, we would ground it more fully in our struggles against that repression and violence. So I think that in terms of the pandemic, one of the things that seems to have brought into or created an opening for us to imagine new forms of hacking, actually. So it's interesting to think within this concept. I would say another thing, thinking about some of the work, Sarah, that you were speaking of as well around opening up cities and finding spaces that can be hacked, that can be used in different ways. Just a small anecdote as well, but as folks probably know, San Francisco, San Jose, we're in the heart of Silicon Valley. There's a tremendous amount of dispossession here. This is happening in many places, but the kind of on the street life that was possible in San Francisco 20 years ago is slowly disappearing. Bookstores are disappearing, all those ways that we mark, the art spaces, theater spaces, they're just getting pushed out or they're becoming less, the landscape is visibly changing. But one of the, so we celebrate the small moments where we see we can fight back against that. And I just named two things maybe very quickly, which one is we learned of this bookstore in the financial district, which is obviously the heart of where this is happening, this small bookstore that can only open when it doesn't rain because the entire book stock is actually inside the small window where the it's a small shop window. And so the stock actually has to come out of the store for the book shop to open, but it's also clustered in an alleyway that has been, they're always kind of beautifying the financial districts of cities. And so it's partially terraced and there's, some architectural pieces around. So it's, this bookshop is one that, not only can it come out into the city, but then has a kind of plaza that it can reclaim when it opens and when it does art readings. And so it's essentially a closet that people have turned into this space. And it's not just bookshop, it's also, like many small pamphlets, and it very much has a kind of push towards circulating a number of texts, documents, literacies through its stock. And during the pandemic, when a lot of things were San Francisco shut very quickly, a lot of it shut down and has not reopened. A lot of San Francisco is still boarded up. So this kind of became a pin that was dropped in the city that then we could start to, and a lot, Sarah, that you were saying around this, I think is very helpful for us. That then a lot can start to proliferate from that pin drop. And Kuba, you were speaking of this too, with the, part of the hacking strategy is, I think, finding the moments of making a map so you can find the moments of rupture that then you can open things up and make something else possible. And a number of dreams and strategies and technologies can proliferate from that moment. So this pin drop on this little bookstore led us to starting to think about how we could connect with other projects. A comrade of ours is doing a really interesting project. She's doing a lot of work right now around eviction struggles, which in the pandemic has been huge. And they're working on a project to, there was a woman a decade or more ago that in an act of protest against being evicted actually jumped from the Oakland Tribune Tower and committed suicide as a kind of public performance of dissent. And so they're going to create a memorial in the city to mark that spot and to try to then circulate a number of direct actions in relation to the anti-eviction struggles that they're participating in. So we've been thinking through with projects like the Counterinsurgency Lab, Methodologies Against Forgetting and Oblivion, trying to think through ways that we can create a relay or a connection across these moments of proliferation and situate them in a larger kind of strategy of reterritorializing the city, however temporary, right? These can be just temporary autonomous zones. We like to say temporary autonomous zones of knowledge production to call attention of ways that we might want to read that space. But to reterritorialize the city when we return to it. I think that there's one of the, Alessandra and I, we're very excited about this city guide as a tool as well. And thinking through what kind of map could be made, what kind of path could we chart through a number of these spaces where we've been able to wedge something open and reclaim an autonomy in a kind of vastness of a city that otherwise is very much organized around forgetting and oblivion, or as Manolo, as you said, commodification. And I would just maybe add really quickly one of the places we've learned this, as Manolo said, is through really thinking through and taking seriously space of encounter and taking both the space term of that seriously and also the encounter part of that seriously. So a way of bringing people together wherever it is, and also always in relation to the space where those folks are, where we're converging folks, convening folks, and what is made possible in that moment. And one of the places that we've learned this is very much working with mothers who are organizing in the Bay Area against their children being killed by police. I think we've mentioned this in numerous spaces, but right now we're really thinking through ways that they use vigil to reclaim spaces in the city where their children have been killed, and to bring other families together in that space, and to make sure that a longer history of police violence doesn't occur one incident and one killing at a time, but in fact can converge in these spaces of vigil where they invite other families and invite other mothers to speak, and are constantly bringing the mothers together in this way. This is also happening, and this is something that we have lost to some extent in the pandemic, and we're extremely excited to get back to. This is also happening in the ways that families here have been organizing against police violence in their communities, particularly in some of the peripheries, like Stockton, which is a place that many people in the Bay Area, in the immediate Bay Area, are being displaced to. They've been organizing around barbecues, and many of those barbecues are they have different art practices at the center. So there's we've worked together, working with mothers, have come up with a lot of these strategies together over years, and these ideas, and all of this has been something that we've all learned from, things from printing up pictures of everybody in their community who's been lost to police violence, creating tables when we show up there with large sheets on them, and collectively pinning with safety pins all of these images onto these big banners that then we hang in the parks. With CCRA, one of the things that we've done is we started making these timelines of police shootings and police operations, so that we started them just on paper with pen, and then gradually have made these into these like large scale vinyl banners that we print up, that then we bring to a lot of these barbecues, and families write in new new information into that, or use it as a kind of station or a place to engage with a archive of what's happening in their community, and also can write. We encourage them to actually write and interact with these banners. And so I think there's you know, many ways that as we're reemerging from the pandemic, that we're eager to reactivate some of the spaces that have maybe gone a little bit dormant, but also to recognize the places where things have opened up that we can seize again. And just maybe one last example of that is City Lights bookstore, which probably a lot of you have heard of. It was the kind of where the beat poets emerged, and it's still very much present there. If any of you come to San Francisco, we will take you there. And the bar next door, which is Vesuvio's, which also has a whole history of Kerouac and all these. Probably people have been there. But one of the some of the laws that came in during the lockdown in San Francisco were laws that, and maybe this was true in a lot of other places too, but laws that bars that didn't serve food could not open, but if you served food, you could still function in a certain way. And that produced a lot of very exciting collaborations, because suddenly a lot of these bars had to work directly with a lot of these food establishments. And one of the things that has you know, given that has made possible in there's an alleyway between Vesuvio's bar and City Lights Books. And one of the things now that they've done is they shifted all of the tables outside into this alleyway, which many places did in the pandemic. There's now, you know, food that's coming through there, and they're doing these, I mean, like many cities do, they're doing these First Friday events and kind of opening up, bringing in speakers and microphones and, you know, small tables of literature. And so, you know, there are ways that in the context of the pandemic, a lot of possibilities for different proliferations have been born.
That's great. Thank you both, Manolo and Annie. I mean, it was really insightful to get some kind of perspective on how much of a gentle, long-term and sophisticated job it is to even think about reaching out to non-Western strategies from a Western perspective, and how, as Manolo, you're saying, how more difficult it's becoming to do that in a way that doesn't kind of try to capture and commodify, but a kind of a necessity to do it. And I think what's come up from what Annie's saying as well is also the essential task of trying to look and be aware for these moments of pinpoints on a map of rupture, which we can then use in sustainable and new ways to kind of remake and rethink our environment on our terms. And how important it is, as Manolo was saying as well, to try and think of porous ways of working that can forge ways and linkages across different forms of discourses and institutions, so we can challenge common sense. So it would make sense to say we have a kind of to City Hall, we have a solution here that's ready to go, but it's not the common sense solution as it is, but it could be the new common sense in a way. And how we might use hacking tools and strategies in order to facilitate that. I'm already aware that I mean, I'm absolutely delighted with the way that this conversation's gone, and I know it's yielded incredible information for us to work with and to work on, and hopefully to continue sustaining all kinds of conversations and strategies and activism through DPE and beyond. And I'm aware that many of us have different obligations, and there's about 20 minutes left now. So rather than me asking another question, I know we have some continued collaborators amongst us who returned a couple of times. And I wondered if any of you had some questions or observations or contributions to make towards our discourse and debate, which is moving, I think, in a really interesting strategic way. Yeah, go on, Andy.
I mean, it's really not much. I've just really enjoyed listening and look forward to. I feel bad for not doing my homework or preparation. I haven't watched all the videos in advance, but it's been actually interesting to hear it this way around. So this might just be an observation that I think you've already sort of been talking through a little bit, but it's my interest as well. I mean, yeah, the labor involved in hacking, in kind of going into the institution and doing the long march through the institutions, or hijacking and finding those spaces can be quite exhausting. And I suppose as can the sort of labor involved in creating the new or carving out the autonomous spaces or just doing something completely on its own. I just wonder if there's kind of like, how in your experiences you've chosen to do one or the other, because I mean, I suppose there's kind of, I know they're sort of twin tactics, but a lot of the time you are in the moment forced to decide, okay, well, I'm going to go and either create this thing outside of the institution, or I'm going to step inside and do this and make a sort of decision as to where your energies are best spent. And I just wondered if it might be something that you could sort of talk about in terms of your own experiences, whether you've ever done it and it's not worked out, or whether you've gone down one path and thought, that was a close call.
Maybe I can try.
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, just like also an anecdote, I think that, or maybe not anecdote, maybe first an observation, that I think currently there is a very urgent discussion about funding schemes and ways to support kind of grassroots activism. So there is discussions about like changing models from charity to solidarity, or basically like thinking about sustainable means of supporting kind of grassroots coalitions. Because I'm in a camp, but basically we need money. I mean, like as a very baseline. I mean, if you say that you do not need money, it means that you have them from elsewhere, which is fine enough. And some people just can commit. That's also good. But then people either. But then maybe coming back to the funding schemes. Typically, like when we like Manolo and Annie talked about this NGO, industrial, non-governmental industrial complex. It has its own strings attached to the funding that you can acquire, and the ways how this acquisition process unfolds. So basically, you need to spend a lot of time on applying, for example, right? All the funding is short term. Then you need to manifest accountable results, whatever, however funders define it. You need to spend a lot of time on your organizational capacity on just securing funding. And basically lots of this funding later on goes to just administering funding that you have received. So you have like this weird loops in which you just create organizations just in order to maintain organizations, because you need to spend such a lot of time on getting on churning out all these grants that you need in order to maintain your own structures. And I think this is extremely problematic, because people, instead of working with movements, instead of unionizing, instead of committing to a struggle or trying to do for a social good, they spend their time on filling in forms and applications, and then like managing budgets, and at the end just trying to report on them. I mean, obviously I do understand, like, and I think that there is a matter of mistrust, or like one of the kind of this is or like institutionalized mistrust, because typically then we discuss about ways of managing public funding. Of course, like we like with full respect, we have like this due scrutiny and so on and so forth, right? But then the problem is that like on the top of social hierarchy, you have people who basically manage funding in a way that is completely intransparent. You have like lots of different deals and ways of dealing with. I mean, I'm talking about the central government and tops of central government, the central banks, this kind of stuff. Then on the bottom, you have this kind of like all this panopticon of funding organizations, in which like you always consider people who are recipients of these grants as potential as people who are like potentially like potential fraudsters. It's also like it also relates to the culture of of providing social welfare, right? Now if somebody gets a grant from a, or like gets a universal credit or whatever, is painted as if he was or she was like a potential fraudster. It's a whole, and this the same comes to lots of NGOs or people who try to operate with public funding from the bottom up. That's why I think it's crucial to actually address these issues, because also, like I see it in Poland, in the context of culture wars, you have like we are dealing with the organizations on far right who are very well funded, who are like, you know, who are receiving like money from lots of different sources, and typically they are not very well scrutinized. So basically, they just, or there is a level of trust, but because they are politically aligned with like whatever they call it, conservative, but in fact it's very often a fascist cause, they can do with this money whatever they need to do. Like the same in states with far right think tanks and so on and so forth, right? You get quite a lot of money that goes into a proper political work, whilst in a kind of like on this kind of liberal lefty side, you have this funding schemes that always ask you to do everything but politics. I mean, they always tend to present, you have to justify your actions as if it was a social work and so on and so forth. You have to depoliticize yourself in order to be eligible for funding. And I think it is very problematic because it means like that in the midst of this social struggle about the future of not only our societies, but I think also of the global polity, you get one side is pretty well funded and the other side just struggles to get by. But I know that it might be controversial, and I understand that, you know, all the necessities to get transparent and to be properly to spend public money responsibly and so on and so forth. However, I think it's important to address these problems of funding structures.
Thank you, Cuba. I think that's again really insightful. Is anybody? Sorry, I'm interrupting. Anybody else jumping in?
Well, could I jump in real quick? I just wanted to, yeah, we're always in the same situation. You know, we do CCRA work 24/7, and there's, you know, literally no funds, and I'm underemployed as an adjunct. As I said, I'm Ronin, but we made a collective decision that I would try to get a nonprofit gig. So, you know, like my official titles for CCRA for funding purposes, you know, as our kind of front is I'm a research director. So we started applying for, you know, there's a lot of gigs in the nonprofit world that keep popping up that are similar. Anyway, the point I wanted to make was that what we did collectively decided to do was to map these job descriptions and to kind of map our whole process. And so I would get interviews or, you know, you have to submit these kind of writing tests and so on. And we would map every step of the process and then map the, using these kind of job announcements and then the material that the nonprofit makes available to map the nonprofit. And we, you know, over maybe we've been applying for a lot of gigs. I've got a lot of interviews and no job, which that's another story. But we have a tremendous map of the nonprofit industrial complex in the process. So, you know, we're not fucking around, even though they keep fucking with us. we're trying to map what these folks are doing and what these, you know, what this system of capture really looks like. And you know, there's some well-intentioned people, of course, there's some good efforts and stuff, and some language that we're also learning from too. It's not, you know, not to make it all sound like it's us or them. It's complicated, right? And so, you know, then we learn, you know, new language and new strategies. We remind ourselves of some of the old tools that we used to use that have been now kind of appropriated by the nonprofit. You know, all what we would used to do around coyuntura that we learned in Chiapas in the 80s and the 90s, working with illiterate communities, you know, communities that don't read and write so much. the workshops have to take on a whole different kind of approach. Very, very kind of art-based, right? You know, representing stuff through drawing and stuff. So we're seeing all that all that now really common in even in like these big high-tech you know, nonprofit gigs, using you know, dry erase boards and drawing and all this kind of stuff, scribing and that kind of stuff.
Can I add quickly something very quickly, because I think it's interesting that we are touching this aspect of like funding situation can be really exhausting when you have to keep afloat a structure, and if you don't have like the right economic means to do so. So if I can speak for from the association, the Arte Utile perspective, this is actually what we have been trying to understand, and we are talking about association, but when it's actually like doesn't have like the association, the Arte Utile is not a real association. I mean that it doesn't have any legal framework. So we have been really, as the archive, it doesn't exist in a place. It's like an index of information, and it's actually an excuse to rethink the structures that we have to deal with, but we recognize that they don't really work anymore pretty well. And if we replicate the same idea of being an association, then we are going to be trapped in this mechanism that Kuba was mentioning, right? Like to try to get funding because we have to survive, and how can we keep doing actually the work that we would like to do? So the idea of, and it's exhausting to answer Andy, but it's less exhausting if we are doing it together, right? Yeah. As like a common struggle, I would say. So this idea that, like to go also a little bit back, like that change is possible. Change is possible. It's really hard to do so, but like if we do it together, because we really believe that it is possible to really do micro step and micro changes toward like a bigger one. I think that's what is interesting, because you learn so much in the process. You also lose a lot, but you can actually start, you know, like let's say oil a little bit the machine, and perhaps at a certain point it would be enough so it can actually change and transform. So for example, like we operate pretty much in the economy of the artwork, of the art world, sorry. And I'm talking by my perspective, but John has another point of view, as Gemma, as Tanya Bruguera, as Alice Ratson, etc., etc. So I'm just naming some people that are involved in the process. But we have been trying really to push with the idea of changing how institutions or museums collect. And we have been using the archive in order to rethink from the purchase agreement to the certificate of usership. But it's not like a paper, or it's not like a text, it's actually a legal document. So how can we actually use these beautiful terms or these beautiful concepts that we put forward or we put on the table when we have this amazing theoretical conversation into practice? And the fact that we don't have like a structure or like a legal framework which function in like reality, it makes this thing possible, because it allows us to really play with rules and regulamentations and laws, for example. And it was like a very interesting process to intervene into a collection of a museum that is thought to be there beyond like the span of life of human beings. So it's supposed to be there for the eternity. So, you know, like just to put another thing on the table that, yeah, that I just wanted to mention. Thanks.
Maybe just like to, can I just add, because like I kind of like painted this black and white type of image just in order to make an argument, of course, because obviously, like typically on the ground, you have a lot of complex situations, and I think that there are a lot of officers working in the different funding structures or municipalities that are very well aware of the problems, especially if you like Sarah, they come from a sector, so they are pretty well aware of how to make it. And sometimes, you know, they just find ways. So, you know, like what I found astonishing with the Office for Post-Artistic Services is that we got like a structural grant from Sigrid Rousing Trust. And this was like a structural grant that enabled us to spend money on the people who are actually to pay for work of people who are managing the structure. And then, you know, like we've just it's really small. I mean, it's not a very large grant, like £30,000 yearly or something like this. But because we were able to structure it properly, you can do a lot of things if you are also having a network of people with whom you are on whom you can rely, and you build trust with lots of different social agents and municipalities, and then you are with institutions as well, because then, you know, if you have this trust, for example, we were able to organize extremely, actually pretty large festivals like Anti-Fascist Year that at the end entailed about 150 actions all over Poland. Just because people trusted us and wanted to pitch in to this kind of celebration of anti-fascist values. So they co-organized programs. We were just basically operating a web page on which they were pitching in the programs, right? Like theater pieces, exhibitions, major museums, but also smaller collectives contributed. And you have like a pretty large festival based on this kind of latent resources, these connections, but this glue that is comes out from people's interactions and long-term struggles as well. And then like the funding just basically contributes a bit to maintaining the core operation, whilst that connects possibly like Association of Art Utile as well is a way of connecting people and mobilizing resources that are out there and providing it with a pitch and with a tonation and a direction, which is, I think, also very important.
Okay, I think that's another really great set of points. Really, I think, you know, with Alessandra bringing up that change is possible, but it's, you know, a lot easier if we can connect and do it together and network, and also what Cuba's just pointed out, that beyond the black and white kind of policy decisions that we need to be aware of, there are very many ways of working with, and often using art as an alibi to work in between the polarities and the cracks to produce something that's meaningful and realistic change, which, as Alessandra says, begins to, and as Tanya Bergera insists on, takes us beyond the symbolic into the tactical struggle of trying to effect real ground up change, which Sarah's given us a great insight to, and also Annie and Manolo have. I'm minded of time, and I'm minded that our official two hours is up, and on that really good kind of almost natural closure to an arc, I'm minded to draw us to a temporary conclusion for now, because we'll be able to pick up. But also, as always, I'll ask if anybody has any final points to make, if there are any urgencies that people might have, so I don't rudely cut off people who are really wanting to say something. No, if that's okay. If that's okay, then I just want to say again a really genuine and grateful thanks for this session. It's been great to be a part of, and it's great to also have the opportunity to think and to talk and to learn with you. And as I say, you know, as part of the process of the DPE Symposium that was also alluded to before, we'll be taking this forward. We'll be trying to extract points of possibility from it, which we'll publish. We'll be trying to think of some of the key questions and urgencies that we need to address to take next steps to make our debates more sufficient, which will then in turn allow us to reapproach you guys and together approach new voices and new people to talk with in order to continue learning and to building hopefully more strategic tools that can allow us to affect change and can also connect those murmurs of change into, as we were talking a couple of weeks ago, into kind of global murmurations of ground up activism, which try to continue and rescue the community and friendship and conviviality that lies at the heart of real non-financialized change. So thank you very much for that, and see you guys soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good seeing
Bye,
everybody.
everyone.
Cheers. Bye.
Yes.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Well chaired.
Thanks. Bye.